Welcome to Leadership Bites with myself, your host, Guy Bloom. This is a leadership podcast where I have conversations with colleagues, I chat with guests, and sometimes there'll be just me talking. You can connect with me at livingbrave.com, and when you enjoy the episode, subscribe and please tell everyone. Amy, fantastic to have you on this episode of Leadership Bites. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm super excited. I say this a lot, but I just get such great guests on that I get excited every time they come on. So in my 50s, I'm like a 15-year-old opening up a present. So I'm super pleased that you're here. And just for people that just don't know who you are, Amy, it would be great just to have an introduction for them, and then we can get into all the things I'd love to talk about.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm a scholar. I'm a researcher. I'm a speaker. I'm a professor at Harvard Business School, where I have just completed 25 years on the faculty. So time does fly when you're having fun. And I've been doing research on teams and organizations for the last 30 years or so. And I live to kind of give some of that back. So I'm delighted to be here.
And you know, there's many things about the role that you inhabit, and I've seen the breadth of work that also you've generated, and I'll put links to that in the description for people to definitely have a look at. And, you know, I have a kind of a question that is one of those, I'm almost going to be embarrassed to ask it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But, you know, how do you get to be a professor at Harvard? You know, so that's a good gig, you know, but was there an advert and you just, you know, no, how did it happen? I'd love to hear the journey that, you know, hey, you know, there I was, and that's how I got there.
So the one word answer is study, but the longer answer is luck and just curiosity, I suppose. So I started out right after I graduated from university the first time. I became an engineer working for an iconoclastic inventor, architect, futurist named Buckminster Fuller.
Oh my goodness.
So that spoiled me. Right? That spoiled me for real work. There was no way, you know, in a sense, there was no way to go have a real job after that, because Bucky, as we all called him, treated everyone with such respect and such enthusiasm. And working around him was an exercise in contagion, you know, about hope, about possibility, about human ingenuity. And he treated us all as if we had a perfect right to be there. I was 21 starting out. So there was a sense, for me at least, what work could be like that later on I realized wasn't characteristic of the workplace more generally. But Fuller was quite inspiring, and he died just a week short of his 88th birthday. In the process of figuring out what next, I decided, you know, almost by way of giving back, to write a book clarifying his mathematical work, right? So just like, we'll put that aside. So that's, but I think it ends up being important, because in the process of writing this book, which, you know, approximately nobody would want to read, I learned that in fact, I could be a writer, right? That maybe I was a writer, right? I had been in college, I had nothing but problem sets, you know, very, very little writing as an engineering major. And I was terrified of writing, but then I learned that I could do it. I could sort of stop and slow down and think carefully about how to be clear. And that became something that I loved doing. And yet, there's no question I wasn't going to do that in the field of engineering or math. And in the process of sort of mastering these skills of writing and teaching in that period, I discovered organizations, right? And my next job, who was also for another wonderful entrepreneurial type person, Larry Wilson, I was in and out of big organizations, right? So I was working with Larry and so many other colleagues on organizational change programs. And that's where I got the bug, right? That's where I thought, wow, organizations are really interesting, workplaces are interesting, and I'm hopelessly undereducated. So I decided, almost on a lark, that I'd apply to PhD programs in organizational behavior. I hardly knew what that meant, but someone suggested it to me. I thought, okay, I'll do that. back of my mind, I was thinking, A, I won't get in. B, even if I get in, I can't afford it. Little did I know that, well, A, I got in, which was kind of, I suspect probably because I had finished a book, right? So the evidence was I could start something and finish something. Maybe that mattered. But what I didn't know, and now everybody knows when they're looking at these things at all, is if you get in, you get a full scholarship and a stipend, right? So what's a stipend? Well, a stipend is that they're going to pay you essentially a living wage to study. Who gets to do that? So at that point, right? Who knew? Exactly. Of course, now we have the internet and everybody knows everything. But I didn't know that, and so when I learned that I was being accepted into this program and that it sort of came with what to me seemed like a reasonable salary and no expense, I just thought, I'm in. Right? I didn't really understand what I was signing up for. Anyway, so I ultimately, at first, had been 10 years out of school. It was a new field. It was quite horrifying. I thought many, many times I'm flunking out of this program, but ultimately I figured it out. I figured out what the field was about and what kinds of things I might be able to say. And I stayed, and I guess I did well enough to get hired as an assistant professor 25 years ago at Harvard Business School. And then each time, of course, I thought, well, I'll never get to stay here, right? I won't get promoted, but that's okay because I've learned so much from being here. I learned so much about teaching. I learned so much about research and writing and publishing. And each time, lo and behold, they kept promoting me till I was a full professor. And now I've been that for about 15 years.
I don't know why I'm laughing. It's just, I'm still getting over Buckminster Fuller.
I mean, sorry I went on so long, but it is a kind of
perfect,
happy accident, right? That's how I got to be a professor at Harvard.
Lots of people have moments in their life, and it's a beautiful thing when they come quite early on. And it's particularly sometimes when you just don't know the value of the experience that you're having. And, maybe that can come at any age. And for some people, it never happens. But there are just these key moments. And I think back to, I'm a lifelong martial artist, and I met a very particular person who, because my sort of childhood was an absolute disaster. That's a whole nother story and a bottle of wine. But this individual became the father figure, became the guide. But of course, I didn't know he was fulfilling that role. I didn't know certain wisdoms were being given to me because I was just turning up and doing training, and he was letting me teach other people, and I was only very young. Yeah, but it's that thing but who knew? And of course, I look back and I go, yeah, that's why I think like this. This is why that stability was given to me. So it's beautiful when I hear another kind of, when you say a name that probably even you didn't realize who he was, even though.
Absolutely. It's just an accident, really, because my path happened to cross. I happened to hear him give a talk while I was in college. I happened to be quite struck by it.
Yeah.
And then just before graduating from college, I thought, I've got to get a job, right? But then I thought, maybe I'll just write him a letter. Well, that's silly. Like he's not going to read it. He's not going to read it, right? But then it was more of a therapeutic gesture than a practical one. I thought if I write him a letter, I'll get this off my chest, and then I can get back to the practical job of finding a job, right? So I wrote him a letter, essentially not asking for a job, but asking for advice. Right? I've been studying these things and blah, blah, blah. And, any advice? Well,
yeah.
I got a letter. I got a letter back within a week. Yeah. And it basically said, please join me in my Philadelphia office, which I thought was a job offer. And of course it was, but my parents looked at it and said, well, what will you
does he mean for tea?
Yeah. Right, exactly. I mean, there was no clarity to it at all, but at that moment I had total faith that this was going to be life-changing, right? And so I didn't even really, I think I wrote back and said, sure, but then there was no more correspondence. And then truly 5 or 6 months later, I just showed up in Philadelphia, and he acted like that was perfectly normal, right? Just sort of showed me a desk. And it did turn out that there were two young men who had been his engineering team, and they'd both gone back to graduate school.
Right.
And so there was this little void. So there was something for me to do.
Fortune favors the brave, right?
Right.
Yeah. And, I've got to share, I've never told this little story, but when I was 13, 14, parental mess disaster, but I came across this article in a magazine, martial arts magazine in the UK, and there was this Chinese gentleman teaching martial arts, and he was taught by Yip Chun, who's the son of Yip Man, and Yip Man taught Bruce Lee, right? So I remember, right, his address was at the bottom, and I wrote him a letter. I'm 14.
Wow.
Well, because there was no, didn't have a phone number, I got a thing called a pen, a piece of paper. And I wish I kept it, because now I'd have taken a photo of it, but I sent it off, and it was no doubt the ramblings of a 14-year-old, let alone the ramblings of a 50-year-old. And I just, hello, blah, blah, blah. And he lived in Blackpool and I was in Birmingham, which you don't know, but it's North and Midlands and South exactly. And I just got this letter back, nearly a month later, that said, please come and see me on a Saturday morning where I teach. And the rest, I became a Friday student, I became an indoor student, I then traveled to blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, what makes you go, I'm going to write a letter? Because everybody else around you will go, he's not going to say yes.
Right. He's not going to answer. He's probably not even going to read it.
Yeah.
Right? But you just decide, well, it's probably worth it to me to get it off my chest.
Boom.
Right. And the stamp, I recall, was 13 cents. And I do remember thinking, well, that's a waste of 13 cents. But why not? Right.
It's funny, isn't it? And it's like that. There's a film called Sliding Doors, I think. Gwyneth Paltrow? And if you what would happen if you just hadn't? Who would you be today? Right.
Who knows? Right. I'd probably be a math teacher, which would be pretty good, but different.
Yeah. Oh, right. I'm going to move. I could stick on this one for a while, but I'll move us on. So, here you are, and you're in this role where probably regardless of whether or not you want it or seek it, it's prestigious. It holds a certain kind of oomph that goes with the organization, and that sort of that role that you hold within it. So for you, and where I think, what are you putting your efforts into right now? Because I mean, and I don't even know if sort of the whole COVID situation comes into it, but the reality is that leadership is inherently, there's so much written about it, we could waste time talking about a model, but just where's your head at? What are you putting your energy into? What are the thoughts that you're having that just are pertinent to, for people that might be looking to move into leadership or in leadership role, and just almost what's on your agenda?
I hate to say it, but leadership is on my agenda. Leadership is the sort of umbrella category that keeps me up at night. And to get even, to get a tiny bit more specific, it's leadership in the face of uncertainty, which sounds kind of obvious. And yet at a deeper level, most of at least our models of management historically don't work very well in the face of uncertainty, right? They work well, management is about planning and setting goals and setting KPIs and, giving people feedback that's plus when they hit them and negative when they don't, as if in time one, we have a clear enough line of sight on time two that we can specify what should be done, what it looks like. Now, I know that intellectually we all appreciate that that's not how a lot of things work anymore. But I think emotionally and habitually, we don't appreciate it very well, right? So that we still don't, we don't cope very well with uncertainty. We don't cope very well with, well, it could be this and it could be that kinds of thinking, with the result that a lot of people at work, a lot of associates, team members, employees are more anxious than they need to be, because in a way they're getting mixed signals. They're getting mixed messages from those to whom they report. And so the kinds of the ways that leaders at all levels, frontline supervisors up to CEOs and maybe even heads of government need to show up is not the way most of them do show up. Right? They need to show up with a high level of humility about how little we know and how challenging the situations we face are. Right, and that's not false modesty. That's not sort of throwing up your hands and pretending you have no skills or no expertise at all. That's just a genuine, rational stance in the face of what lies ahead, which, we could list our favorite worries or risks or challenges, if you will. And so sort of showing up with that sense of humility, I think that corresponds with a genuine, we hope it's genuine, passion to make a difference, like a belief that if we give it our all, we can actually make something important happen here, is a sort of a good start. And then I'm thinking a lot about curiosity. Curiosity is something that most adults start to lose over time. Little children have it, of course, spontaneously. By the way, it was one of the things that was so stunning about Buckminster Fuller in his late 80s. He was still just so darn curious. I mean, I'd be curious about, I got a new pair of running shoes. He'd be stunned by how lightweight they were, right? How the things in his youth were so different. And he'd be curious to learn more about how did Nike do that? Anyway, so curiosity, which to me is a crucial leadership stance, primarily because the simple reason, Peter Drucker told us this, it drives us to ask more questions, right? And managers are not the ones with the answers, they're the ones with the good questions. And there's a whole lot we could think about what constitutes a good question. And so curiosity is the force that will drive me to be interested in who are you and what do you bring? And what's happening out there? What do the customers want? And what are the risks that lie ahead, and all the rest? So, so I think a lot about, well, how do let's say we recognize those kinds of things as vital in an uncertain world, then how do we do better at instilling them in people? Because sometimes it seems that the people who are given positions of power and authority are not the people who have the humility and the curiosity to use them well.
Yeah, there's a lot in that, what you've just been saying, and I'm picking up on a couple of things. This interesting thing about curiosity and your willingness to have vulnerability,
yes,
and to see vulnerability as not making you vulnerable. And I find that an interesting topic, of especially when we have, for some, the characterization that leadership means strength. I need to emit and radiate control. And if I have curiosity, which may mean I am going to give you an ambiguous answer,
right,
that actually may be very clear to me, as in, look, I'm absolutely clear about the fact that we don't know, then how, so there is a clarity. I'm personally confident, but from politicians through, oh, so you don't know then, Mr. or Miss so-and-so, and well, no, I do know what you don't, but you're not making an actual decision. And so this kind of, it suits certain agent provocateurs internally within an organization. Oh, they don't know then, all the way through to you don't know then, with a microphone in your face. And I think there's a lot of maturity that can happen intellectually, but as a flight or flight response, I kind of protect myself by playing the kind of the alpha role, because that seems to secure the ship for the moment. I don't know if that resonates when I say these things to you.
Absolutely. And I think I completely agree with what you say. And I think it's ironic, because in fact, by trying to exert control you really reveal your insecurity, your vulnerability, because you can't control uncertainty. You cannot, you can't win with control in an uncertain world. There's a section in my book, The Fearless Organization, called Be a Don't Knower, which comes from the CEO of Eileen Fisher, whose name is Eileen Fisher, who and many other wonderful CEOs, including Anne Mulcahy of Xerox, sort of advocate the power, and from a position of power, it really is powerful to say, oh, I don't know. Important issue. I'm going to look into that, or I'd like to learn more. I mean, most of us, human beings will recognize that as a sign of strength, not weakness, right? It's weakness to cover up, to self-protect, to be absolutely allergic to vulnerability. But, until you said that, I talk about curiosity a lot. I talk increasingly about vulnerability. I never really realized how closely connected they are until you said it, right? It's that actually curiosity makes us vulnerable, because if I'm curious, I'm open. And if I'm open, I'm vulnerable, right? If I'm curious, I want to find out more about what what you've seen, what you bring. And now I'm vulnerable to bad news, dissent, all those things that we humans don't love.
It's fascinating, as I say, because martial arts is such a big part of my life since I was a child. One of the things I always instill, but also I notice, is that if you ever go into martial arts classes, there are two types of cultures. There are the ones where the instructor at the front is the best one in the class. Nobody can beat them. They're unbeatable. Their word is law. And what you see is that they may have competent students, but they'll never surpass the level that is being set by the instructor, because the instructor's unbeatable. And then you go into other classes, and the instructor's very competent, but he's got students who can basically tie him up in knots because they've surpassed that person. And what you realize is this whole idea, when somebody says, God, I'd like to become an instructor, I go, okay, then first of all, get comfortable with failure, because all the best instructors, practitioners, have failed more times than the beginner can imagine, because that is that willingness to constantly fail. And of course, when you've got a 6'5", 19, 230 pound, whatever it might be, beast of a human being who's comfortable with failure, then I don't mind practicing with him.
Right.
But I don't want to practice him with him if he doesn't like losing. Because I'm going to get hurt. I'm going to get damaged. Exactly. So you can see that if there's a pecking order of that people start to become a little bit submissive. They let the other person win so they don't get hurt. They give in quite quickly, just like in an organization, right? It's, am I going to get hurt if I offer this into this space? So what you realize, and this is part of my transference, I mean, not coming at it from where you're coming at it from, but working with people on a daily basis, is senior level toxicity. If you, I don't talk about affecting, it's infecting. And it's not the fact that you affect your people, it's the fact that you infect them. And then you wonder why somebody says to you, you end up saying to me as the coach, Guy, people just don't seem to have that. Like when I was doing it, there wasn't such a gap between me and my manager, and that's because your manager didn't infect you. So again, it's all this kind of stuff that I think I'm hearing in what you're saying that I resonate with, which is why I'm smiling, because I really hear that, I think, in my experience with things as well.
You're making me think the best, I hadn't thought about this before either, but the best teachers are not the most expert, the very, very top, the gold medalists. They're the ones who can get into, really get into the process of bringing others out, right? Of bringing the best out of others, which of course I think is a definition of leadership too, right? That leadership is the force that harnesses the energies of others to achieve greatness, whether that's in themselves as individuals or for their team or for their organization. And I think we too often in this culture are respecting the best only, right? The person who's sort of the top of their game, or, wins the championships, or gets that top spot, or makes the most money, or, you name your yardstick, rather than the person who is best able to draw out in others that which is needed and that helps them grow and learn and contribute.
I really buy into that. And I guess part of this comes also down to the dynamics, that almost systemic creation of what is being measured gets done, right? And what drives people through reward. And, if you're in a private equity kind of, 3-year earn out kind of trying to, all the way through to big annual bonuses from this 5-year strategy. And, as these things push that behavior, and I think I'm really intrigued by almost good people doing bad things.
Right.
Because actually, I've never met anybody that I said, if this was a job interview, what would you tell me you'd do? and they give you this brilliant answer, and you go, so why aren't you doing it? Have you met my boss, or or whatever? And actually, it's very rare that people don't know what to do, or don't have at least 2 or 3 things they could do to find out which one's the right one. But actually, it's the punitive kind of, back to the good old carrot and stick. What's going to hurt me? Or what's my reward going to be? So I don't know how much you look at systems and that reward element and that kind of internal stuff that says, you know what, you can do all the culture work you like. You can do all in fact, one of the things, I don't know, I often say to people, be careful what you ask for. Because if you let me develop, or you let people develop them to a level of people knowing what really good looks like, but the systems prevent it, you're probably going to go backwards in terms of your engagement, because now you're showing people the shop window and going, you can't have it.
Right.
And I just wonder how much of your work is systems, and actually it's not about the development, it's about what you do internally to allow people. How much of that kind of operates with you?
A great deal. And in fact, in my MBA teaching, I teach a course called Becoming a General Manager. A general manager is someone who maybe runs the enterprise or runs a business unit. In other words, they're not a functional manager. They're not a marketing manager or a manufacturing manager.
Right.
They're the general manager who, by definition of the role, need to be able to consider those multiple perspectives and the needs of those different parts of the organization, whether public or private sector organization. And clearly a big module in this course is rewards, but we spend very little time on formal rewards, meaning, is this bonus scheme better than that bonus scheme? I mean, there are others who teach things about that. That's fine. That's great. That's not what I teach. What I teach is about the informal rewards, which can be far more influential in people's actual behavior. And the informal rewards are, the things that, and this does bleed into culture, right? The things that get acknowledged, the things that, the sort of important people are doing, the recognition, the sense, sometimes even just the sense of opportunity or advancement, or to feel good about the work you did today, right? If you start thinking like a social psychologist about what shapes people's behavior, and then it's not just rewards, it's punishments as well. It's, what are the things that you get sanctioned for that you just don't want to do because of that, and sometimes the answer is risks that go wrong. Well, then what's going to happen? Then you're going to get nobody willing to take risks. So when you sort of do, I don't know, there was a wonderful social psychologist years and years ago, Kurt Lewin, who introduced the idea of force field analysis. Just step back. Anyone can do this, right? And think about, well, what are the forces encouraging that behavior? What are the forces diminishing that behavior? And you can get some pretty good insights pretty quickly as to why people aren't doing the things you wish they did, because in fact, they're not being rewarded for it. And they may even be penalized for it. So then you have to think differently about the system, right? What changes do we make in the system so that it is less perverse in its rewards and punishments?
I think that's a very interesting place, I think, for people to operate from, which is not just looking at what they may believe is right, but actually trying to, I think what I'm hearing, that ability to step away and going, well, if you're if you were watching this on a live video documentary, almost, I often say, what would you be shouting at the screen? I know you're saying that, but it's quite obvious what he's scared of.
Right.
It's almost, can you step out and look in? And,
Yeah.
that what would you shout at the TV screen if you saw this situation is often a great kind of way of, because you can often see it, but then it's whether or not there's a willingness to do something about it. So one of my key questions that I'm really fascinated in, and I'd love you to give me your thoughts on it, is this idea about bravery and what bravery looks like. So I talk about trust, accountability, bravery, and connection. And bravery, which is a whole nother podcast, but in terms of bravery, there's bravery is the thing that people have very often when they start a role. I've been brought in to sort something out, maybe, or I've been given a license to operate, or that's my role here now. And then there's this, and it's not the most gracious of terms, but I talk about sort of almost going native. You've been there for so long now that you've now become part of it, whatever it is. So to stay, so to stay elegantly disconnected, to be an integral part of it, but also not to allow yourself to be so in it that you can't look from the outside in. Because I think there's something about how do you talk to people, and whether or not it's even a topic for you, about it's not that you won't have the idea of what needs sorting. It'll be your sense of the effort,
right,
and your sense of the reaction or the dismissal, or where you get validation from, or your own ego. And I wonder how that, so bravery, when actually you're three lines down on the hierarchy, or whatever that might be. So I don't know how that comes out as a conversation for you.
I think about bravery all the time. Right? So let me back up. Right. So probably the single topic I'm best known for academically and probably more broadly is psychological safety, which is a kind of badly named term to describe a context where you feel your voice is welcome, right? That speaking is, and I want to be clear about this, not easy, but expected and palatable for that reason, right? I can speak up with a dissenting view, or I can say, I think that's an error, or I can say, I need help, right? That those are things not easy, right? Not fun to be a person acknowledging vulnerability or disagreeing with the boss, but necessary in an uncertain world. So this is what I spend a lot of time thinking about, looking at, studying, like under what conditions do people really take seriously the idea that their voice is welcome, right? And that's turns out to be not normal, right? Not the norm, right? So it's much more normal to be, I'll wait and see, I'll hold back. Nobody ever got fired for silence, right? So increasingly, I will say that courage, anyway, which is similar to bravery, courage and psychological safety are two halves of the same coin, right? That it's, in part, I say that because it's never easy. Right? It's going to take effort. It's good. There's going to be that moment where you've got a lump in your throat and you're just going to say it anyway. And you do it. Why? Right? You do it because you care. You care about the team. You care about the customer. You care about the patient, whatever the situation might be. And you do it because you know it might be the right thing to do. It might matter. And your colleagues won't penalize you for it. Right? But it's got to be more than you won't be punished. Like we don't do things just to avoid punishment, but it's sort of that combination. So what does this mean? This means we've got to have ways of encouraging bravery. Because I think just about everything we do in an uncertain world takes a little bit of bravery. It just does. Right? It takes a little bit of bravery to get up in the morning and, get back on that task and hope that you can make a little bit of difference against it.
And this leads me to, I've been fascinated by the advent of cancel culture, which almost gives me an anxiety even talking about it, frankly. But psychological safety counterweighted with cancel culture.
Yeah.
It is a very interesting thing, because one might say, we know what that is on social media, where the few who sound like the many attack in a very kind of intimate way, which never existed before, and people are fearful of it, so people keep quiet. And in the workplace, we can feel that coming in more and more, because if I say something on my private social media, all the way through to what might cancel culture look like internally. Well, people starting to talk about me to more senior people, or I get cancelled in a professional way, kind of thing. So I think that's always happened, where people can turn against you. But I think there's something going on in society as well that is almost magnifying it to a point where I wonder if that's people. I don't know. People say, well, it's not really happening inside an organization. I go, no, but it happens in society, which I think might be making us more fearful as people. And I don't know if that, just your thoughts on that.
I think you're onto something. I think we are very fearful. I mean, this is a time, it's so funny, because this is a time of great fear. I mean, that we're in a heat wave now. I don't know if you are, but I'm in this.
I wish we were, but no.
Yeah, well, don't be careful what you wish for. I'm in the great state of Maine, where essentially nobody has air conditioning, because it's just never hot up here. Up meaning north, and down east, as they say, and in the state of Seattle and Oregon right now, they have temperatures being recorded that are not just on the high side. They're literally outside the entire range of recorded history. I mean, they don't even overlap with the cloud of data points that have been taken over the last 100 years or so, right? So, and I think that's just one, but that's one of many things we should be afraid about, right? Because human beings cannot exist. Your brains don't work above a certain temperature, and we're finding at least parts of the U.S. or the Southwest having some of those temperatures. Okay, so there's plenty to be afraid of. God knows we shouldn't add on to that being afraid of each other, and I think there is that risk. There is that risk in the cancel culture of it's so fraught. It's so one must tiptoe so delicately that you're always better off just holding back, right? And if we're coming to the conclusion that we're better off holding back, we are in big trouble. And so I wrote a piece recently about productive fear versus unproductive fear.
Okay.
And in a sense, productive fear is the kind of fear that drives us to do something useful, to invent more renewable energy, because we're afraid of the impacts of rising temperatures, for example. Unproductive fear is the kind that leads us back into the fetal position, right? To just not feel willing or able to do anything and to team up effectively with our colleagues and friends to make a positive difference. And so we've got to get better at sort of separating those things that we really ought to team up and do something about, and then those things that might get in the way, and be a little bit better at forgiveness, right? I mean, I think we are all fallible human beings, right? We will all make mistakes, full stop. That's just a given, right? That's not something we can debate. That's a given. The thing that we don't know for sure is how will people respond to us, when we make mistakes, when we get it wrong, when we step in it, when we say something that wasn't intended to be, but is heard as hurtful, right? Are we willing and able to forgive each other in the way that we, of course, want to be forgiven?
There's something here about checking intent, isn't there?
Right,
I have to check your intent. If I'm penalized, or if an individual is penalized for vocabulary purely on a subjective level, that means that the individual can make choices about words that you now take out of my vocabulary because of your personal response to them.
Right.
As opposed
Which I
to
not know in advance. Like how do I know? I mean, do I know enough about you to know your personal response?
And if you check my intent and you say, well, if your intent is not to harm me, then I believe you can give somebody a free pass on their language because, you have no intention to harm. Yep. This is your vocabulary. Okay. And I have this sense that one of the key things that I'm very keen on, and I think I'm hearing it in what you say, and I'd just like to hear your thoughts on it. I have something I call the truth triangle, which is your truth, the organization's truth, and society's truth. Right?
Yeah.
And you're in the middle of that. So there's what you want, there's what the organization wants from you, but you operate in a world that maybe 25, 30 years ago wasn't, we weren't so connected to it through all the mediums that we have. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I talk about is not social responsibility, but not corporate social responsibility, social responsibility. Right. And I'm wondering if the way you come at it, it's similar to some things I think about, which is if you're enabling somebody to hold space on an idea, to give another human being feedback, to check in on their intent, a lot of the counterweight to some of the things that is happening in the world is our ability to educate our managers and our leaders, to educate their people on how to be a leader of self, and then to have a language and a control that goes back into society. And it's almost in some way, it's, our small way of affecting it back against what I would see as a potential infection, and saying what we're talking about here isn't just for corporations, isn't just for organizations. It's inherently true. And your application of it should be in the world wherever you may be. And I don't know how that sits with you.
Absolutely. This is really old, but there was some beautiful research done by Paul Adler way back in the early 80s on NUMMI, which NUMMI, which stands for New United Motor Manufacturing. And it was qualitative research looking at this manufacturing plant, which was basically the first plant in the United States. It was a General Motors plant in Fremont, California. Still belonged to General Motors, but after 18 months of shutdown, Toyota came in and managed it for them. And basically it was, the plant had been shut down because it was the worst plant in GM's entire, network, right? It just had the most absenteeism, the worst quality, it was just terrible. So they laid everybody off. And 18 months later, Toyota came in and took it over, and they hired everybody back, or at least they hired the people who hadn't gotten another better job, right? So they essentially hired back the worst of the, in theory. Fast forward, becomes the best plant, of course, right? Because it's just how do you manage, how do you enable people to be great? And the reason I thought of this story was that in some of that work, what you see is that people went home. These wonderful team members went home, and they found themselves being better human beings in their families. They stepped up after dinner to help with the dishes. They no longer said, "Hey, I've done my 8," sat on the couch with a beer watching the game, right? They just became more respectful, better team members at home and at work, and they were very conscious of it. They were conscious of how this experience of having good management that was really focused on learning and excellence, of quality and speaking up, how that changed them, right? How that made them better. And that has a ripple effect.
Yeah.
I think it does infect much more broadly.
I've come to really believe that, when I started out, training management skills and etc., moving into leadership, but thinking it's basically the same thing, but for more senior people. And as I've matured, I've come to that kind of conclusion that actually there's the skills that one may require to do the role, but in terms of behaviorally, it's actually about us as human beings.
Yes.
And, the fact that you can read a P&L, that's not a leadership competence. That's a management task or a role specific capability. If we're talking about your behaviors, it's how you interact, it's the impact that you're having, whether or not people engage with all those kind of things. But isn't that just like being at home? Isn't that just, do your kids look forward to having a performance management conversation with you? If you've got to give them feedback, oh my God, mum or dad's going to yell at me. Or is it actually, I'm going to engage you. We're going to have a very transparent conversation and you're going to be accountable for it as much as I am. And, and I find that this stuff, I don't know, but I'm sure you do. People come back to you and say, I'm using this everywhere. I'm presuming you get that a lot.
Absolutely. Leadership is about recognizing that you cannot, full stop, cannot control other people. I don't care if you think you can. I don't care if you think your role has the right and the ability to control other people. You cannot. People will only do what they choose to do. Right? I understand you have the right to fire people and so forth, but there is always going to be a gap between what they will give at the job to avoid being fired and what they really have available to give. And that's true in families too. Right? So leadership is about recognizing I cannot control, right? I can only inspire, enable, engage, create the conditions in which, all of that very indirect, dare I say it, soft stuff that does in fact start with self-management and then reaches out to kind of doing a better job with managing and enabling good conversations to happen in the face of uncertainty. And then finally also building the kinds of relationships, the kinds of relational capital that lead people to care, that lead people to want to and able to withstand the temporary assault of disagreement or conflict to contribute, right, to the larger goal.
So I'm super aware that I can run down 100 rabbit holes with you with the topics that we have. So just as we kind of maybe come towards that kind of the end of this time together, because otherwise I'm going to turn this into a 3-day podcast and you're going to say, Guy, I really have to go now.
I'm hungry.
I'm hungry. So I'm hyper alert to that. I've just got a couple of hopefully relatively quick fire questions, which is number one, if somebody said to you, Amy, I'm interested in leadership or improving my leadership, what should I read?
Oh.
Right? What should I read? Because I've got my kind of go-to. Look, there's 100 books you could read, but I would definitely suggest this one and blah, blah, blah. Do you have that kind of just instinctively, it probably doesn't matter where you are in life. This one's an absolute cracker. It'll give you a good frame of reference.
Humble Inquiry by Ed Schein would, I think, be my number one.
Say that one again, please, Amy.
Humble Inquiry.
Humble Inquiry. Nice.
And Ed is really in many ways the father of culture, right? He's the one who really brought the concept of culture to the fore way back. And that is I think that's a beautiful book about the things we've been talking about that sort of humility to inquire and to pull forward pull out the knowledge of others. I'd also, I'm a huge fan of, I think it's an incredibly powerful and useful book. And it's in the same vein, but a very different kind of book, which is Leadership and Self-Deception. Don't know if you know that one. It's by the Arbinger Institute. Right? Yeah. So it's so humble, it doesn't even have a person's name on the author byline. And what makes it very different is that it's written as a novel. I'm not going to say this is great fiction. I mean, but it's great leadership advice, and it's this impact intention stuff we've been talking about.
Great.
So I think it's an incredibly must read for all would-be leaders or current leaders who want to up their game. So maybe I'll stop there.
No, I mean, that's leadership and self-discipline. I knew about humble inquiry. I didn't. So that's great to hear those. And, I think my last question then is, I imagine you have 100 people asking you 100 questions a day, Amy, what are your thoughts on? But just in the current kind of climate that you're in, what's that kind of top? Yeah, that's the question I'm getting a lot, Guy. And
okay,
great just to hear that.
I'd almost, if I were to ask you to guess, I think you'd guess it. So here it is. It's how do we do psychological safety with work from home?
Yeah. Okay.
How do we create the kinds of environments where people are willing to speak up and willing to really lean in and engage when we're all connecting through a tiny square in a computer screen? And my short answer is you're right to worry, right? You're right to think candor and engagement takes a hit when we are mediated by video communication rather than sort of around a table together. And you can overcome it, right? You can overcome it by both by using some of the features that the technology brings that real life doesn't bring, like the chat and the polls and so on. But also more generally, just by a little bit more structure, right? For example, let's do a round. Like, let's get Guy, what are your thoughts about the project? Okay to pass, but we will systematically
bring people in.
And then maybe we'll do polls, and maybe we'll do whatever we can to kind of force voice, like to or maybe a better way to say it is to lower the hurdles, because the hurdles just went up. So what do we do, even if it feels heavy-handed, to bring the hurdles back down?
So you may have to do something that is almost a conscious competence. You may have to,
yes.
And wear it in like a good pair of shoes, right? We know they're the ones we want to wear, but we're going to have to get used to them.
Right. And it might feel gimmicky, right? It might feel gimmicky to use some of the little features, or to do a round, or to have different people kind of cold call the next person, which encourages everyone to sort of stay tuned in case your name is next.
But let's see what sticks, right?
Right. Let's see what sticks.
Okay. Well, listen, Amy, I literally want to kind of lock you in my back room for the next 3 days and talk to you through. And no, you can't go until you've answered this, but I'm going to not do that. Which makes me sound incredibly odd, but you've been an absolute joy. So I just want to say thank you so much for this time. I know it's precious, and we're all busy, and I know you are. So just from me to you and anybody that's listening, just a very big thank you so much for your time.
You are so very welcome, but truthfully, it has been a joy in return. I loved talking with you. I gained as much as I gave, so thank you.
That's very gracious. Take care. That's it. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please share so others get to hear about us, and subscribe so you keep up to date on new episodes. Also visit livingbrave.com if you want to connect with me and find out more about executive coaching, team effectiveness, and changing culture. Oh, and of course you can buy my book Living Brave Leadership on Amazon. So on that note, see you soon.